Picture your own family tree and how quickly it goes dark. 2 generations back, maybe 3, and then nothing. Just a village name, a border that moved, a war nobody ever fully explained. Now picture a community whose family tree went dark too, except a laboratory in Israel just switched the lights back on after 1,500 years. An elderly man in a cramped flat in Tel Aviv, or a small apartment in Queens, has spent his whole life believing his ancestors were traitors, men who arrived under a Khan's protection or a Shah's decree sometime after the silk caravans first crossed the Oxus River. That story is 300 years old. It took one swab, one vial of saliva, to prove it is almost certainly wrong. Out of roughly 30,000 Bukharan Jews who once lived across Uzbekistan and Tajikistan under Soviet rule, researchers needed only a few hundred DNA samples to ask the one question nobody in that family tree could ever answer. Did this community begin in Central Asia at all, or did it begin 2,000 miles away, in a strip of land it had not physically touched in over 1,000 years? The answer sitting inside their genome is stranger and older than any trader's legend. And it carries a twist near the end of this video that most people researching this topic still get completely wrong. Stay with this one through to the very last block, because the biggest reveal here is not the one you are expecting right now, and skipping ahead will cost you the one detail that makes the whole answer finally make sense. The real question is not whether Bukharan Jews have lived in Central Asia a long time. Everyone agrees they have, for at least 15 centuries, maybe longer. The real question is narrower and harder to answer. When the ancestors of this community first settled along the Silk Road, did they bring Middle Eastern ancestry with them that has survived, largely intact, to this day? Or did centuries of marriage with local Persian and Turkic populations quietly dissolve that ancestry until almost nothing of it was left? Oral history says one thing, geography argues the opposite, and somewhere underneath both stories is a detail almost no one talks about, a pattern in the genome that shows up not just in Bukhara but in Jewish communities on completely different continents. A pattern that will only make sense once you see where this trail actually ends. That trail matters today for a very practical reason. Most of this community left Central Asia within a single generation, mainly for Israel and the United States after the Soviet Union collapsed, which means the question of shared origin can still be tested directly, in living people, right now, rather than only in old records. The first explanation is the simplest. Maybe Bukharan Jews are not really from the Middle East at all. Maybe they are descendants of local Central Asian converts to Judaism, the way some peoples along the Silk Road are believed to have adopted the religion of merchants who passed through. It is a tidy theory. It also runs straight into the region's own religious history. Mass conversion movements in Central Asia are documented for groups like the Khazars, but no comparable state-level conversion has ever been recorded for the Bukhara Basin. And Bukharan Jewish communities were practicing distinct dietary and burial customs recognizably tied to Levantine Judaism as far back as written records go. The second explanation is the trader legend itself, the idea that a handful of merchant families settled in the region sometime after the 8th century, once Arab conquest opened new caravan routes, and simply multiplied over time. It is a satisfying story, but it cannot explain the ossuaries. Jewish burial containers inscribed with recognizably Hebrew and Aramaic names have been dated to the 5th and 6th centuries in the Merv region, in what is now Turkmenistan, 2 full centuries before the trader legend's own starting point. The third explanation blames the Persian Empire, the theory that Jewish identity here descends entirely from deportees, moved east by Persian rulers centuries after the Babylonian exile, with no direct thread back to Jerusalem itself. It sounds plausible until you remember that Persian resettlement records, patchy as they are, never mention this specific region as a destination, and the earliest concrete textual evidence we have does not come from a Persian decree at all. It comes from a rabbi. The fourth explanation is more modern and more cynical, that community members simply adopted a Bukharan Jewish identity for social or economic advantage, once trade with Jewish merchant networks became profitable, borrowing a label rather than a bloodline. That theory struggles against a simple fact of endogamy. Communities that marry into a group for status tend to blend into it within a handful of generations. Bukharan Jewish communities kept marrying almost exclusively within their own group for well over 1,000 years, long enough that geneticists today can still find the signature. The real breakthrough came from a rabbi, not a scientist, and it happened long before anyone had a lab. In the Babylonian Talmud, In a passage in Avodah Zarah, a sage named Shmuel bar Bisna, writing in the first half of the 4th century, describes traveling to Margiana, a Persian province that is now the Merv oasis in Turkmenistan, and refusing to drink the local beer. It is a throwaway line about kosher law. It is also the oldest solid evidence that Jewish communities existed in Central Asia, roughly 600 years before most trader legends even begin. But a single sentence in an ancient text cannot answer a genetic question. That took until 2010, when geneticist Doron Behar and an international team published a genome-wide study in the journal Nature titled The Genome-Wide Structure of the Jewish People. The team ran genetic markers scattered across the entire genome, not just a handful of blood proteins, comparing Jewish communities from more than a dozen populations around the world, Bukharan Jews among them, against non-Jewish populations from the Middle East and Europe. The method, in plain terms, is a bit like comparing everyone's family photo album at once, looking for the same faces, the same features, repeating across albums that supposedly have nothing to do with each other. For decades, this had stayed unsolved because most earlier genetic work relied on single markers, usually the Y chromosome passed from father to son, which told part of the story but left researchers guessing about the maternal side and about communities, like Bukhara's, that had almost no earlier genome-wide data at all. Behar's team described being struck by how consistently the mathematics placed geographically scattered Jewish groups closer to each other than to their non-Jewish neighbors. A result strong enough that multiple independent statistical methods, run separately, kept landing on the same map. Here is where it gets strange. The closer the researchers looked at Bukhara specifically, the less this looked like an isolated case, and the more it looked like one piece of a much larger, older pattern stretching from Central Asia all the way back to a single narrow strip of land on the Mediterranean coast. Start with the story Bukharan Jewish families actually tell about themselves, because it turns out to be more useful than most trader legends. Passed down for generations, the oral tradition holds that the community descends from Israelites exiled after the fall of the First Temple, deported east under Assyrian and Babylonian rule roughly 26 centuries ago, and never fully returned. On its own, oral history is not proof of anything. Family memory drifts and borrows across a few hundred years, let alone 26 centuries. But the surprising side fact is this. Almost identical oral traditions, claiming descent from the same exile, exist independently among Jewish communities in Yemen, in Georgia, and in parts of Kurdistan, communities separated from Bukhara by mountain ranges and empires that never shared a border. Picture an elderly woman in a Samarkand courtyard in the 1950s, before most of the community emigrated, reciting a genealogy to a granddaughter by lamplight, naming an ancestor's ancestor's ancestor as someone who left Jerusalem, not Persia, not the steppe. Two numbers matter here. 26 centuries claimed by the oral tradition against roughly 15 centuries of hard-written evidence anyone can currently prove. That 11th-century gap is exactly the kind of thing genetics, not memory, would eventually have to settle. It also helps to know the scale of the community being discussed. By the mid-20th century, roughly 30,000 Bukharan Jews were living across the Soviet republics of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, concentrated in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, a population large enough to sustain its own synagogues, its own dialect of Persian written in Hebrew script, and its own unbroken chain of exactly this exile story, repeated in nearly every one of those households without any coordination between them. Most of that community left within a single generation, after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, resettling mainly in Israel and the United States, which is precisely why blood and saliva samples from this population exist in modern research databases at all. Settling the 11th century gap starts with a single sentence buried in a religious law book, which is where the trail actually becomes solid. That sentence belongs to Shmuel bar Bisna, a 4th century sage who almost certainly never imagined being quoted 2,000 years later in an argument about DNA. His mention of Margiana, the Merv oasis, is brief, technical, almost bureaucratic. The kind of detail a legal scholar records only because it actually happened to him. The reveal here is simple but important. This pushes verified Jewish presence in Central Asia back to roughly the year 320, nearly 600 years earlier than the Arab conquest trader theory most casual histories repeat. The surprising side fact is where Merv sat on the map, not on some remote frontier, but directly on the branch of the Silk Road connecting Persia to India and, eventually, to China. meaning any Jewish community there was never isolated so much as positioned at a crossroads that funneled genes and languages in multiple directions at once. Imagine the scene physically. A dusty caravan stop in the Karakum Desert, mud brick walls, camel bells, sacks of silk and spice stacked against a wall, and somewhere inside those walls a small community keeping kosher law strictly enough that a visiting scholar bothered to write about it, centuries before anyone thought to ask why. One number against another, a single Talmudic sentence from the 4th century, against 0 surviving Persian government records naming this population at all. Some historians push the timeline earlier still, arguing that the first Jewish settlers reached the region as far back as the Achaemenid Persian period, sometime after 559 BCE, following trade and administrative routes opened under Persian rule. That theory rests on thinner textual evidence than Shmuel bar Bisna's account. No surviving Achaemenid-era document names a Jewish community in the area directly, which is exactly why the 4th century Talmudic sentence still functions as the earliest point most historians treat as solid rather than merely plausible. Text alone still cannot prove bloodline. Something buried in the ground would have to do that instead. The ground delivered in 1954. Soviet archaeologists excavating near the Merv oasis uncovered ossuaries, stone boxes used to hold the bones of the dead after the flesh had decomposed. A burial practice tied to Jewish law rather than to the Zoroastrian fire burial customs common in the region at the time. Inscriptions on several boxes, dated by archaeologists to the 5th and 6th centuries, carried names recognizably Hebrew or Aramaic in structure. The reveal, physical, datable, non-textual proof that a distinct, identifiably Jewish community was burying its dead by its own religious law in Central Asia by at least the year 500, independent of any Talmudic mention. The surprising side fact is the timing gap itself. Roughly 180 years between Shmuel bar Bisna's sentence and the ossuaries, long enough that this cannot be one traveling scholar's isolated encounter. It has to be a settled, continuing community. Picture the excavation itself. A Soviet-era dig team, decades before anyone cared about ancient DNA, carefully brushing dust from a stone lid under a flat desert sun, cataloging it as one more artifact in a season's dig, never expecting it to matter to a genetic story 70 years later. 2 numbers, side by side, one Talmudic sentence from the 4th century, and dozens of ossuaries recovered from the 5th and 6th. Archaeologists working the same Barium Ali site near Merv also recovered separate Jewish inscriptions dated to the earlier Sassanid period, meaning at least 2 independent archaeological layers, centuries apart. Both point toward continuous Jewish presence rather than a single passing group. History and archaeology now agreed with each other completely. What neither one could do was prove that these people's genes actually traced back to the Levant rather than simply their shared religion, because proof of religious practice is not automatically proof of ancestry. For that, the trail has to leave the ground entirely and enter the bloodstream instead. It entered the bloodstream decades before anyone sequenced a genome. In an earlier study, researchers drew blood from 113 Bukharan Jews and 134 Georgian Jews, then living in Israel, testing classic genetic markers of the era, blood group types, isoenzymes, HLA immune system antigens, the tools available before DNA sequencing existed at scale. The reveal was modest but real. On most markers, both groups resembled other Jewish populations more than they resembled their non-Jewish host populations, while a handful of specific markers showed unusually high or unusually low frequencies compared to nearly everyone else on Earth. The surprising side fact is what those extreme frequencies usually mean in population genetics: not contamination, not error, but a signature of a small founding population whose descendants kept marrying within the group, generation after generation, a genetic fingerprint left behind by isolation itself. Picture a hospital blood draw room in Israel sometime in the early 1980s. Vials neatly labeled by community. Researchers running assays that would look primitive today, but were state-of-the-art then. The 2-sided number here. On most markers, similarity to other Jews. On a smaller set, extremity found almost nowhere else. 2 patterns that should contradict each other and instead confirm the same underlying story. Similar blood marker patterns had already turned up in other dispersed Jewish populations tested around the same period, in Iraq, in Yemen, in North Africa, which meant Bukhara's results were not an isolated statistical fluke specific to one small sample. They fit a wider pattern researchers were only beginning to notice across the entire Jewish diaspora, decades before anyone could put a name to it. Crude as these tools were, they were the first hint that something in the blood matched something in the Talmud. What was still missing was the whole genome, and the ability to compare it directly against actual Middle Eastern populations rather than just against other Jewish groups. The whole picture needed the Y chromosome. The piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son for thousands of years, immune to the blending that happens with every other chromosome. Researchers comparing Jewish male populations from Yemen, from Georgia, and from Bukhara, three communities separated by deserts, mountain ranges, and roughly 4,000 miles, found something that should not happen by chance. These men shared specific Y chromosome lineages with each other at rates far higher than they shared them with non-Jewish men from their own home regions. The reveal is direct. Geography predicts almost nothing here. Ancestry predicts almost everything. A Bukharan Jewish man's closest paternal genetic relatives, statistically, are not his Uzbek or Tajik neighbors of 1,000 years. They are Jewish men living in Sana'a and Tbilisi, who he will likely never meet. The surprising side fact involves lineages geneticists have associated with ancient populations of the Levant, the same broad region as ancient Israel and Judah, though the more specific named haplogroup claims tied to this finding come mostly from amateur genealogy DNA projects rather than peer-reviewed papers, and deserve a flag of caution rather than full confidence. Picture three men, one in a market in Bukhara, one in the mountains outside Tbilisi, one in a Yemeni highland village, none aware the others exist, each carrying a near-identical marker passed down a male line for roughly 2,000 years. The two-sided number, thousands of miles separating these communities today, against a shared paternal signature old enough to predate all three communities' current homelands. That is a striking number to sit with. Of all the men on Earth a Bukharan Jewish participant could statistically resemble on this one chromosome, the closest matches kept turning up in two communities thousands of miles away, rather than in the city he actually lived in. One chromosome had spoken. The rest of the genome was about to say exactly the same thing, louder. That louder confirmation came in 2010, when Doron Behar's team stopped looking at single chromosomes and modeled the entire genome at once, using every Jewish population they could sample, Bukharan communities included, against reference populations from across the Middle East and Europe. The reveal is the strongest yet. Across multiple independent statistical methods, Bayesian clustering, neighbor-joining trees, and multidimensional scaling, all run separately so that one method's bias could not fake the other's agreement. Jewish populations consistently landed in the same genetic neighborhood, positioned as intermediate between non-Jewish Middle Eastern populations and European populations, distinct from both and distinct from their own regional Central Asian neighbors. The surprising side fact is how little that pattern cared about geography or century of separation. A Bukharan Jewish sample and, say, an Iraqi Jewish sample clustered nearer to one another on the genome-wide map than either clustered to the ordinary populations living next door to them today. Picture the actual output researchers stare at. Not a family tree with names, but a scatter plot. Hundreds of colored points, and the Bukharan Jewish points sitting in a tight cluster with other Jewish diaspora points, deserts and oceans apart, while their non-Jewish neighbors' points sit somewhere else entirely. Two numbers worth holding on to, roughly 15 documented centuries in Central Asia, against a genome that still, after all that time, refuses to fully blend in. The study's authors were explicit that this was not a foregone conclusion going in. Earlier, smaller studies using only a handful of markers had produced messier, less consistent pictures, and it took a genome-wide approach, hundreds of thousands of markers at once, to finally cut through the noise and show the same underlying structure every time the data was sliced a different way. Every earlier clue, the oral history, the Talmudic sentence, the ossuaries, the blood markers, the Y chromosome, had been pointing at the same door. This is the study that finally kicked it open. Line them up and the pattern narrows fast. Legend claimed a 26th-century-old exile. Text proved 15. Bone proved continuity by the year 500. Old blood markers showed founder effect extremity. Y chromosome data showed one paternal thread tying Bukhara to Yemen and Georgia. And the full genome showed the same thread running through every cell, not just one chromosome. Each layer of evidence gathered independently, using different tools in different decades by researchers who were not trying to confirm each other, kept narrowing toward one specific origin point and it was never Central Asia itself. It was a strip of land less than 100 miles wide, on the far side of two deserts and a mountain range, that this community had not called home in over 1,000 years. The data had stopped hinting. It had converged. Here is what the DNA actually reveals. Bukharan Jews are, in overwhelming genetic majority, descendants of ancient Levantine populations, the same broad Middle Eastern ancestral stock shared by Jewish communities from Yemen to Georgia to Iraq, not descendants of local Central Asian converts, and not primarily the product of intermarriage with Persian, Uzbek, or Turkic neighbors, despite 15 centuries of geographic separation from that homeland. The 2010 genome-wide study placed them, cluster for cluster, statistically closer to other global Jewish populations than to the non-Jewish populations they have lived beside for generations. The Talmudic record, the Merv ossuaries, and the Y chromosome data all point the same direction independently. Their ancestors did not become a new people once they crossed into Central Asia. They carried an old one with them, and against every ordinary force that erases ancestry over 1,000 years, war, migration, empire, conversion, intermarriage, enough of that old genetic signature survived, intact, to still be readable in a lab today. That is the promise this video opened with, and the data backs it without hedging. But the real twist is not that Bukharan Jews trace to the Levant. That was, in hindsight, the expected answer. The genuinely strange discovery is how that ancestry managed to survive at all, and the answer has nothing to do with isolation in the way people usually picture it. Bukharan Jewish communities were never physically cut off from their neighbors. They traded with them, spoke Persian and later Bukhari dialects alongside them, lived under the same Khans, the same Russian and Soviet administrations, in the same cities. Genetic isolation this strong is supposed to require literal geographic separation, mountains, oceans, centuries with no contact at all. Bukhara had none of that. What it had instead was something almost entirely social, an unusually strict, community-enforced practice of marrying only within the group, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years, while surrounded the entire time by people they interacted with daily. That reframes the whole story. This was never really a tale about a population sealed off by geography, preserved the way a fly is preserved in amber. It is a story about a boundary that existed only in custom, in religious law, and in social pressure. A boundary strong enough to outlast the fall of empires that physically ruled over it. Consider what that actually means. Achaemenid Persia fell, the Silk Road's power centers rose and collapsed more than once. The Russian Empire arrived and the Soviet Union replaced it. And through every single one of those transitions, marriage patterns inside this community barely moved. Empires changed the language on the street sign, they never changed who married whom. And that single, mundane, repeated social choice, generation after generation, is the actual mechanism holding a 2,000-year-old genetic signature together. Not distance, not deserts, not isolation, in the way the word usually gets used. The twist is that the most powerful force in this entire story was never geography, never a desert, never a mountain range. It was a wedding custom, repeated often enough, for long enough, to outlast the fall of at least 3 empires, without ever needing a single wall, border, or ocean to enforce it. If that reframing is correct, medicine should show its fingerprints somewhere else entirely, in a category of evidence that has nothing to do with ancestry statistics, inherited disease. Populations that marry almost exclusively within a small founding group for many centuries don't just preserve ancestry markers, they also preserve and concentrate rare genetic variants, including harmful ones, at frequencies far above the global average, simply because the same limited gene pool keeps recombining with itself. Clinical genetics resources documenting the Bukharan Jewish population list specific inherited disorders that occur at meaningfully higher rates in this community than in the general population, the kind of founder variant conditions geneticists specifically look for as a signature of long-term endogamy rather than recent inbreeding. This is independent confirmation in the truest sense, because it did not come from anthropologists studying ancestry or historians reading the Talmud. It came from clinicians managing patients, decades of medical case reports and carrier screening data accumulating separately from the entire historical argument, and arriving at the identical underlying conclusion. This is a population descended from a relatively small founding group that stayed closed to outside marriage for an extraordinarily long time. Picture a genetic counselor today, sitting across from a Bukharan Jewish couple planning a family, running a carrier screening panel that specifically checks for conditions known to concentrate in this exact community. A direct, practical, present-day consequence of a marriage custom that started more than 1,000 years ago. Ancestry statistics said isolation happened. Medical genetics says isolation happened. Two entirely different fields, using entirely different data, reading entirely different tissue samples, landed on the same closed door. The mechanism behind all of this has a name population geneticists use constantly: the founder effect, compounded by generations of endogamy. When a new population starts from a limited number of founding individuals, every rare genetic variant those founders happen to carry gets passed forward at a much higher frequency than it would in a large, freely mixing population, simply because there were fewer original gene copies to begin with. Keep that founding population marrying only within itself for dozens of generations, and instead of the pool blending back toward a global average, it stays concentrated, sometimes growing more concentrated with each generation. The numbers make the trade-off visible. On one side, elevated carrier rates for specific inherited conditions in the Bukharan Jewish population, high enough that targeted carrier screening panels exist specifically for this community, a direct cost of the pattern. On the other side, the same mechanism is precisely why researchers can still detect a clear, statistically strong Levantine genetic signal in this population after 15 centuries, when ordinary population mixing would likely have diluted it towards statistical noise within a few hundred years. It is the same coin. The founder effect that concentrates a handful of harmful variants is mechanically identical to the founder effect that kept an ancient ancestry marker legible enough for a 2010 Nature paper to detect it with confidence. There is no version of this story where the community gets the preserved ancestry without also carrying the elevated disease risk. They are two outputs of one unbroken practice, marrying within the same limited gene pool, repeated for roughly 50 to 60 generations, long enough for a single custom to leave fingerprints in both a 2010 ancestry paper and a modern carrier screening panel. None of this proves an unbroken bloodline back to a specific named ancestor, a specific tribe, or a precise founding date. Genome-wide studies show statistical clustering and shared ancestral components, not a genealogical chart with individual names attached. And sample sizes for a community this size remain small enough that margins of uncertainty are real. It does not rule out meaningful local admixture over 15 centuries, only that it was not large enough to erase the dominant Levantine signal. Certain other claims circulating online, particularly specific Y chromosome haplogroup labels linked to named ancient Israelite lineages through amateur DNA testing projects rather than peer-reviewed studies, should be treated as unverified until published research confirms them. What the evidence solidly supports is shared ancestral origin and long-term endogamy. What it cannot supply is a single, tidy, unbroken family tree back to a name in a book. Think about your own family for a second. Most of us can name a grandparent, maybe a great-grandparent if we're lucky, and after that the trail usually goes soft. A story about a village, a war, a border that moved. Now imagine that trail somehow held its shape, not perfectly, but recognizably, for 50 generations, not because anyone wrote it down carefully enough, but because of a habit repeated at every single wedding along the way. That is what sits inside the blood of a community most people outside Central Asia have never heard of. Your own DNA is running the same kind of experiment right now, quietly recording every marriage choice your ancestors ever made, whether they meant to or not. 50 generations of one repeated custom, 15 centuries of geographic distance. One genome that still, today, remembers where it started. The oral history said the exile happened. The Talmud said Margiana was real. The ossuaries said the dead were buried by Jewish law. The blood markers said something extreme was preserved. The Y chromosome said the fathers matched across deserts. The full genome said all of it, together, at once. What DNA reveals about the ancient origins of Bukharan Jews is not a legend rewritten by science. It is a legend the science mostly confirmed, in a place almost no history class ever mentions. If your own family carries a story like this, a place, a custom, a gap in the paper trail nobody could ever quite explain, tell it in the comments below. Someone reading it might be able to fill in the part your family lost.